I think the opposite of that was a Christian negativity towards progress, which said, yeah, the world's a mess, but there's nothing we can do about it till Jesus returns, so we're just going to sit back, say our prayers, and wait for a Big Bang, an Armageddon, or whatever. And a lot of Christians still take exactly that view, that it's actually wrong to try to make improvements in the world. It's not just that they don't like this or that or the other scientific innovation. They say we shouldn't be making any improvements in the world because Jesus is going to do all that when he comes back, and it would be arrogant of us to try and preempt that, which is rather like the old Marxist argument that you shouldn't put up the workers' wages because it'll only delay the revolution. You know, that actually let's bring it on, bring on the second coming by not doing anything now. And it seems to me a proper vision of Christian hope would be considerably more modest on the one hand than the optimism of the Enlightenment. In other words, actually, the kingdom of God has been launched, but the way it happens is not by our arrogant technology, but through our service to one another, through our service to the poor, through our medicine, and that's where the two systems might actually overlap a bit, through our teaching, through our education, and those have always been great Christian dreams. And not that we can create utopia here, so that's the pulling back from the arrogance of the Enlightenment to a more modest thing, but to say that there is stuff we can do. And, you know, for instance, the people who abolished the slave trade, Wilberforce in my country, who was it in your country?
I had Lincoln Fellow.
That,
Yes.
well, I'm thinking earlier than that, actually, early 19th century, the people who campaigned, anyway,
right.
Late 18th, early 19th. But the key thing is they were people who were told, sit down, shut up, God will change the world when he wants to. And they were saying, no, actually, we are going to do stuff. And they campaigned, and they really did make radical transformations of the world. And it seems to me that if we lose hope, because we're losing hope in scientific advance, a lot of Christians may just slide back into saying, there you are, told you so, nothing we can do till Jesus comes back. And I want to say, no, absolutely wrong. That's not how the New Testament hope works. And some elements of the scientific advances that we have had, particularly in medicine, actually have been and should be seen as part of serious kingdom work, which really does anticipate what Christians believe God is going to do in the end. So it isn't that we can do nothing, it isn't that we can do everything, it's that we have to have a differently modulated sense both of the ultimate hope and of how we get there.
But how do you get there, I guess? That's I mean, this has been a sort of pessimistically drifting conversation, right? And so the question is, let's stipulate for the sake of argument that in some sense our culture is in a decadent phase, right? That has something to do with the loss of ultimate hope, something to do with the loss of more immediate hope. Do societies break out of those ruts?
Well, I certainly don't think it's like an absolute thing, and I spend a lot of time working in a variety of these areas. So even though I find some of the larger trends to be ones of deceleration, I think that there is still a lot that one can and should try to do. I certainly, the pro-Silicon Valley version would be that in a society that's generally hostile to progress, it's hard to get it done on a political level because you can't convince 51% of the people. But maybe you can do it on the level of a small company where you have to only convince a much smaller number of people. And so that's sort of why I think there is such a role for innovation around technology businesses at this point. It's certainly not the only way it theoretically should happen. I mean, you could have it happen in large corporations. It could probably happen in a governmental context, in a political. There are all sorts of ways it could happen.
But to the extent that it's an issue with, well, I guess you can tell me what you think. If is the fundamental issue more structural, that we have sort of sclerotic bureaucracies and the FDA standing in people's way and all of that, or is there a more fundamental failure of imagination that's related to sort of where we've ended up because of how the religion and secularism dynamic has played out, how the 20th century played out, and so on?
I would say it's both. I think the structure.
Well, yes, okay.
I think the structure reflects
right.
we tolerate the FDA because we don't really think we can have a cure for Alzheimer's. So what does it matter if the FDA stops every drug? We're not going to get a cure anyway, so it's okay. And then I think these things are both cause and effect. They sort of work on all these different levels. I agree with everything that Wright has said. With maybe one nuance. I think it is an open question how optimistic one could be. So I certainly think it is possible that one could be a lot more optimistic, and that there are sort of ways in which this is somewhat self-fulfilling. If you think something can't be done, it won't be done. Yeah. If you think it can be done, maybe you will help bring it about. And so there's this incredible self-fulfilling aspect to so much of this.
Just a nuance, and it maybe this is the scholar's nervous twitch. I wouldn't myself use the word optimism, because that, it seems to me, describes an attitude that some people are optimistic and some people are pessimistic. I would distinguish between optimism and hope. And hope is not simply an attitude that this is how I feel. Hope is something that says something has happened in history which gives me hope of something else that can happen and will happen. And the thing that's happened in history is to do with Jesus, to do with his resurrection, to do with a new world that's been launched, as a result of which, even when I'm feeling pessimistic, I still say I actually choose to believe that there is an ultimate hope. And because we live between those two, I choose to believe, even if I don't feel particularly optimistic about it, that there are things that I can do, that we can do right now to make the world a better place, to feed the hungry, to deal with diseases as best we can. Although it's part of the deal then that part of the optimism of the ultra-enlightenment, sort of uber-enlightenment, might be, have we got a cure for death itself? Can we actually move beyond that? And that's where the Enlightenment, I think, gets to the point of real arrogance, of saying, well, the Christians had this myth about resurrection, whatever. We don't need that. We're going to make us live longer and longer and possibly forever. And it's an interesting sort of alternative, longevity as an alternative to a Christian hope.
This, I think, gets to one of the implicit themes of this conversation is that you could put back together, in some sense, the kind of scientific, questing, optimistic spirit, and this, or sort of reroot it in a kind of metaphysics of ultimate hope. But do you think, I think that, I imagine you have some thoughts on this, because the question of life extension.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything incompatible with indefinite life extension and Christianity. I think in practice the question will never get framed that way. It will always be framed: do you want to cure cancer? Do you want to cure this type of disease or that sort of a disease? So it's not like you're going to take this pill and you will live forever. So it's always going to be framed.
I'm pretty sure Ray Kurzweil was on my flight out here, so I don't know if.
Well, he thinks it will just happen automatically without people doing anything at all. So the singularity is near. Just sit back and eat the popcorn. So that's not going to happen. But in practice, it will always get framed in terms of very specific questions. And I do think that both the hopeful and Christian and ethically correct answer is to always side on the side of, almost always on the side of, yeah, it would be good to have the cure for cancer or this other disease, and so on. And this is sort of a complicated intellectual history question. I think this would be very hard to sort out. But I do think this sort of idea of finding radically extending people's lives was part of the very early modern science project from the 17th and 18th century onwards. And I cannot help but wonder whether that was in part because of Christianity having said that was a possibility. And so if you lived in a world where people said, death is natural, it's just what happens to everybody, then that would not have been a realistic goal. But if you, and this was certainly not part of, say, Greek science in the 5th century BC. There was no Francis Bacon who wrote as though something like this was conceivable.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm not sure that it was ever part of a Christian agenda, because the Christian agenda always was resurrection, and which, if properly understood, would be resurrection not into some fluffy non-spatio-temporal heaven, but into actually a new world, a God making new heavens and new earth. But it seems to me if people are saying that this is something which is now possible, something which is now conceivable. It seems to me more likely that what they're saying is we Christians have had a tradition of curing diseases as best we can and of working medically. And of course we have to remind ourselves that until the middle and late 19th century, the average life expectancy for a reasonably healthy adult man or woman was in the 40s or 50s rather than 60s, 70s, 80s. So that in a sense, it's been already remarkably successful that a lot of people who in generations gone by would have been dead by the time they were my age, mid-60s, are still, well, here we are, still here, living proof that something's happened. So I don't see there's anything wrong in saying we could actually increase that, but the point at which it treads into dangerous territory, it seems to me, would be to imagine a sort of elixir of life, as you say, a magic pill, something which sounds rather like what was in the Garden of Eden and wasn't allowed to be taken.
But I guess the question would be, is that a...
Go ahead.
No, well, it strikes me that, one sort of, we're getting near to the point where we'll segue into questions and answers, but one sort of pointed question I would put to you is, in a sense, does entrepreneurship, does science need religion? But as a corollary to that, it seems, again, as an outsider sort of observing the culture of Northern California, Silicon Valley, and so on from the outside, there does seem to be an extent to which that narrative, to the extent that anything is filling the void left by the collapse of religious belief, it is a sort of quasi-religious vision of the singularity of sort of indefinite life expectancy and so on, that's untethered from any metaphysic, but is sort of promising something that religion used to deliver.
Well, let's see. I don't want to get into, I suspect very dangerous to get into a theological debate here, but I think in the Garden of Eden, if I recall, there were two trees. There was the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they weren't supposed to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Tree of life was not forbidden.
But it subsequently was after they, yeah.
But not in the original conception.
Sure.
And so I think there is this question whether one thinks of death as simply a natural part of life. Every myth on this planet tells us that all that lives must die, to kind of quote Hamlet's evil mother. And we sort of rationalize death in one form or another. And I think the notion that death is unnatural, that it's this sort of fallen or flawed or very screwed up condition in which we find ourselves, that's not a pagan view. That is a Christian view. And so I don't think it was part of the agenda of science or Christian agenda to do this. But I think it was not surprising that it emerged in the sort of world where people thought that was possible.
But do you think that idea, unmoored from a metaphysical hope, could be sufficient to sort of sustain or create a rebirth of the kind of optimism that you think American society needs? And then I'll have a, yeah. Yeah,
I'm always skeptical of metaphysics. I think the thing that is striking on the sort of transhumanist versus Christian thing is how similar they are. And so I think you can sort of point to metaphysical differences, but the thing that sort of is always striking is you're going to have a transformed body. There's going to be this radical transformation of the way everything works. There will be no more random freak accidents that happen to kill you. And so I think it's actually the similarities that are striking, and then one shouldn't try to overlay some metaphysical difference.
And is this not because, a lot of early science, and by early science I don't mean the Greeks or the Egyptians, I mean early modern science in the 16th, 17th century, grew out of a Christian celebration of the goodness of creation. And the old phrase used to be that science was thinking God's thoughts after him, and it wasn't science or religion, it was science grew out of a Christian faith, a Christian exploration. But what's happened since, and again particularly since the Enlightenment, is, and this has happened on several issues. The previous Pope said in a speech at the United Nations that with regard to human rights, what's happened since the 18th century is that human rights, which really grew out of a Christian vision of what it meant to be human, how you should treat your neighbor, etc., that's been cut off from its Christian roots, and it's now been made into a kind of independent, freestanding entity, which then is getting you into all sorts of areas where every possible possible pressure group claims, this is my right, these are our rights, and it's impossible to get past the shouting match between these competing rights because we've cut it off from its roots. Might it not be possible that the same thing has happened with science, that science, having grown out of a faith-based exploration of the world, Jewish and Christian and Muslim actually, because if you're a creational monotheist, there is always this sense of delight and exploration in creation. But then when science cuts itself off from that, kicks God upstairs and says, we now have this progress thing which is just taking us where we need to go. So then you get the archetypal mad scientist or the Frankenstein maker or whatever, because as with the modern confusion about rights, it's been cut off from its original roots. Would there be, if that's A, is that the right analysis? And B, if that's so, would it be healthy to explore ways of putting science and Christian faith back together again, not by going back to the 17th century, but by going on to a different way of conceiving it?
I think, look, I think there is a point where people overdo science and technology. I think there aren't very many people who do that in our society. So I think, you know, the Frankenstein novel by Mary Wollstonecraft was semi-autobiographical because her father was involved in a variety of sorts of experiments, and so it was sort of like, and you know, I have a preference for her father over the rebellious daughter who was not, you know, not honoring her parents, and who, and you know, and we are living in this, you know, and you know, I do think I think there's something about the Faustian ambition of Goethe that's maybe a little bit screwed up, but then, you know, the alternative, you know, is I think it is better than the sort of Nietzschean alternative. I always think of Nietzsche as sort of the first environmental philosopher who rejected both Christianity and the scientific technological utopia and sort of willed a return to nature, to sort of a counterfeit Eden bared red in tooth and claw.
Yeah. But Nietzsche, quite wrongly, I think, saw Christianity as, in his phrase, Platonism for the masses. You know, that this was a way of getting a spirituality that would leave the philosophical academic halls and be available to everyone. And I think that was a radical mistake on Nietzsche's part, because Christianity was never a form of Platonism, because Platonism is precisely a dualistic framework which says that this present world doesn't matter that much, and ideally you inhabit another world already, and you will one day inhabit it completely. That's what people have done with Christianity. To that extent, Nietzsche, I think, was right, but that isn't what original Christianity, Jesus and Paul and so on, was all about. And I think the task then would be not to say we agree with Nietzsche's critique, because there were all sorts of odd things about it, but to say we need to get back to a more robust, holistic, heaven and earth together, faith and science together, way of looking at the world. One of the great commentators in Britain at the moment is the former chief rabbi, Jonathan Sacks. I don't know if you've worked with him at all, but he's an amazing man. He wrote a book called The Great Partnership recently about science and faith, and I was thinking about that in the light of this, and he says, science takes things apart to see how they work, religion puts things together to see what they mean. So you see, that's a sign of a great partnership. And okay, it's an oversimplification, and he knows that, but I think there's something enormously important there. But what you're talking about is so much not science as in, and maybe this is an important distinction we haven't made, not science as in, let's take it apart to see how it works, as in, let's think of something else that we might be able to do, see what it would take to make that work. In other words, to go forward in not just exploration and description, but actually innovation and development.